I would like to first thank Nate Kuznia here for installing the show and arranging the artist lecture today. I'd like to recognize our department chair, Ann Kim. I'm Carrie Longley. I'm the campus art director and associate professor of fine art at IU East. And thank you to the students that are joining us today. You guys, after Travis is done speaking, and I believe Felicia, the other artist in the exhibition, will be joining us shortly. There will be time for question and answer. If you don't feel comfortable turning your video on, you can always type your question in the chat box and I can read it to Travis and Felicia for you. I'm going to start by introducing Felicia and Travis and giving a little bit of information about their background in the arts. Felicia Szorad earned her BFA from Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio, and her MFA from East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. Felicia currently lives in Lexington, Kentucky, and is a professor of art and metals program coordinator at Eastern Kentucky University. Felicia exhibits her creative work nationally and additionally teaches metalworking workshops at both universities and craft centers, such as Penland School of Craft, Aramont School of Arts and Crafts, and Touchstone Center for Crafts. Felicia has received grants to support her creative work from the Ruth and Harold Shinven Foundation, the Kentucky Arts Council, and the Kentucky Foundation for Women. Images of her work have been published in Metalsmith Magazine, The Art of Enameling, and 500 Enameled Objects. Travis Townsend draws, builds, rebuilds, paints, and tinkers upon wood and mixed media sculptures in his Lexington studio. His process-oriented works evolve from sketches and travel through many transformations before being cut apart, reassembled, and reworked, sometimes many years later. Parts are often transplanted or recycled. Travis studied at Kutztown University and Virginia Commonwealth University and has presented solo exhibitions at the Parachute Factory, Washington State University, Manifest Gallery, Doppler PDX, Southwest School of Art, Weston Gallery, and the New Arts Program. His work has been included in numerous group exhibitions and appeared in the publications New American Paintings, the Manifest International Drawing Annual, and the Penland Book of Woodworking. He has been a resident artist at Penland School of Craft, Oregon College of Art and Craft, Vermont Studio Center, and Peters Valley School. His awards include an Emerging Artist Grant from the American Craft Council, a fellowship from the Kentucky Arts Council, 3 sculpture grants from the Virginia A. Groot Foundation, and recent travel grants from the Great Meadows Foundation. Ongoing projects include collaborative sculptures, drawings, and installations with the Smith Townsend Collaborative. You can see their concurrent exhibitions, Wearable Objects, and Sculpture and Paintings in the Tom Thomas Gallery in Whitewater Hall on our IU East campus through Friday, April 15th. Please join me in welcoming Felicia and Travis.
Thank you. Thank you. So I got to shorten up my bio, don't I? But thanks. That's appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen and jump in here. I thought I'd start with just a little bit of backstory before I showed some of my new work. So here's a 2-person show from about 1.5 years ago with my wife, Felicia Szorad. So we're a duo. And you can even see in this show some of the similar works that you have in your exhibition, this piece, and then this necklace of Felicia's. While our works in a lot of ways aren't that similar, they're similar in some ways in the way they're put together, like I should say the process in which they arrive at completion. And then I've just sort of stolen all of her colors. So that's my thievery. So they relate in terms of color that way, but it's sort of her colors that I've just gotten used to after being together now for a couple of decades, right? Those colors that you live with, the colors of other things in our house, become the colors of my sculptures, it turns out. And you can see that here with the close-up of her work, where she's using, and she'll probably mention this, sort of mixture of sort of refined techniques with sort of just sort of handmade uh, elevation of common materials like felting or found pieces of metal. And but then here's some more traditional sort of copper and enamel. And you can see how those colors, I'm just stealing them right directly. Same three colors that I end up on my work. So here's a shot of my studio at home. For a long time, I taught at Eastern Kentucky University, teaching foundation classes, a lot of drawing one, and then also a lot of the theory class, the art and critical theory class at the end for the seniors or juniors. But I always got more work done at home, even though I had studio space there. I tend to be a tinkerer, so I'm like, do a little something and I walk away from it. Do a little something and I walk away from it. And then, of course, after sometimes a long time, sometimes years go by, and then that thing might finally be finished. Here's a shot. This is about as clean as my studio gets. That's a good shot of my clean version of my studio. Right now, it's looking worse. So here you can see some objects in progress. This pod-like form in the back, which I actually like quite a bit, ended up being this thing here. I opened it up and flipped the forms around, but I still like this thing. I think I need to make a new version of this, maybe make it really big if possible. This piece in the foreground eventually was finished to become this object, which finished maybe a year and a half ago, and I was quite pleased with it in the sense that it gets to kind of sort of that sweet spot that I find really interesting. It might be different I'm sure it's different for everybody, but in this case, it's got enough form, like enough formal clarity, so that from across the room, it looks like it's cohesive. But when you get up close to it, it still has a lot of looseness, like it's a really worked over sketch, like it's still in the process of becoming. And that's where I really like my work to be. That's where I find them to be the most exciting for me. And in a way, I guess I'm just making these things to keep myself interested. And I hope along the way that someone else is too, where I'm making these things to have a conversation in a way with other artists. I think that's kind of why I seem to be doing this stuff. And this project, this piece, like if I say, oh, it took me 10 years to work on this piece, I mean, from start to finish, parts started 10 years ago or so, and then evolved and evolved and evolved. It's not like I worked on it every single day for 10 years and this is all I could come up with. It's just that parts evolve, they get cut off from one. I'm usually working on 5 to 10 objects at once, or even paintings too. And if the painting's awful, I just cut it up and use it because I'm usually painting and drawing on plywood. So these things evolve and get orphaned to parts, and those parts get stuck back together. And so there's sort of a mix of intention and accident that I'm trying to get that right balance. Same thing with this one. This was a cutoff. I made this big thing that ultimately I thought looked good from across the room, but didn't have a lot of integrity. It looked too forced. So then I cut a big chunk of it out, turned it on its side, and all of a sudden it's like, ooh, this thing got more interesting than I could have planned. So for those of you who are students, you'll probably get to the point where you can, because my goal all through undergrad at Kutztown University, I had a really great experience there. It's in Pennsylvania, sort of like a hour and a half north of Philly, a little bit, and 2 hours west of New York City. So, but a rural area, kind of. But anyways, as an undergrad, through my undergraduate years, my whole goal was this idea of like, oh, let's see if I can make something the way I envision it. But eventually you can do that. Like you figure out, oh, look, I can make the thing that I imagined and sketched. But then what do you do next? So for me, it's like, what can I do to make these things better than what I originally imagined them to be? Anyway, here's an example from about 10 years ago. I'm just doing a quick history here now. About 10 years ago, drawn on the walls. Oh, that's my crew here, right? That's Felicia, who you'll meet here soon, if she hasn't joined already. Keaton, Josie, and Evie here. They're out in front of the Toledo Museum of Art. My wife is from the Toledo area. That's, Alexander Calder, Stegosaurus-like abstract steel. Well, this is my work. And then I was just showing a family portrait and then showing other images of Felicia's. And I'm not sure why it didn't come through. So I will move on. Thank you for letting me know. So you can see that my sort of my love of, in a way, all my interests crammed into one object. The idea of sort of built models and woodworking and painting and drawing that sort of come together to become a sculpture in a way. So I feel like I became a sculptor through the back door of hodgepodging a lot of other things together, and then it becomes sculpture because, you know, what else are you going to call it? So, but I never, my intentions were never sculpture oriented. They were more like painting oriented or woodworking oriented. So that's kind of funny to me that I became a sculptor. So again, sort of a wall leaning thing, collection of images. For my own purposes, I have these little moments in here that I don't know most viewers would pick up on, of course, but like friends doodling on chunks of wood as they come into my studio, my kids leaving little toys in the studio, leftover project parts from grad school of some of my peers that I just collected and saved. So these things in a way are like little bundles of nostalgia in some ways. So with this one, I'm using this process, and I've used this on many of the ones I've shown you already, is well, I'm cutting these layers of plywood, and this layer comes out of this layer. So it's not like I'm using a ton of wood, really. This is less than a half sheet of plywood, but it creates these volumetric forms that I'm using on the bandsaw, and then I'm letting the glue drip in a very abstract expressionist way. The clamps, you know, they are holding it together in a lot of ways, but they're also indicative of sort of the making process and a way to communicate a little bit to the viewer that maybe these things aren't quite finished. Maybe these things are still in flux. So I tend to sometimes describe my sculptures as sort of like three-dimensional sketches or things still in the process of. Again, you see that plywood form here and the bent laminations where you're taking thin sheets of wood and gluing them to each other. This one is, you know, about 4 feet long, 2 or 3 feet tall. Sort of hits in the idea of the vessel aesthetic in some ways. So this is a work from grad school. So these sherbet colors. I was trying to make these objects that really related to domestic objects that would have these interior things. I was very much interested in that. Sort of the idea of coming from a craft background of kind of studio furniture making was my sort of starting point for grad school. It wasn't my end point, but it was sort of my starting point. And here I'm sort of combining the drawing and the painting and this idea of like how to make a weird toaster oven that's not really a toaster oven, that's actually just references those sort of functional shapes and handles on things. So this is the kind of work I was doing before grad school. Coming out of undergrad, I learned a lot of woodworking techniques. I was carving, doing a lot of heavily carved surfaces and then painting them so they looked like sculptures. So they looked like sculptures, but they were functional. And I thought I had it all figured out coming out of undergrad because I had some sales and some commissions, and I thought, oh man, I got this figured out. Well, this couple was they had some money. They were in Philadelphia and they bought a bunch of stuff from me and from Felicia. You know, her and his end tables. They've since got divorced. I don't know who got what or if they stayed as a set. And then my work shifted. So then they stopped buying stuff. But for a while, you know, I had one of those clients that would just kept buying stuff. And I thought, oh, great, I just need a few more of them. So this is the kind of work I was doing heading into grad school. Very much this idea of figure out a good idea, execute that thing with carving and, you know, and then paint it. And so that shifted pretty quickly during grad school where it became more about the process of making. And then it was kind of funny. My work going into grad school looked like sculptures, but they were functional. And then coming out of grad school, my work was sculpture, but it looked like useless functional objects. So there's still that tie into sculpture and function, just sort of a twist on it. Okay, so what I want to walk through you right now is a show from a month ago that I just installed this year, and then it ended a month ago. at the Joan Derryberry Gallery at Tennessee Tech University down in Smithville, Tennessee. And that's a really nice spaced gallery for my work. Not too big, not too small. Because sometimes you're making these things and they seem pretty big in your garage, but then you get them into a sort of a museum size space and you realize, oh, these things are actually kind of little. So I'll just walk you through it the way you'd enter. So you'd walk into the show, and this is the first thing you see, right as you walk in the door. And again, you see this sort of tool-like reference that I seem to be playing around with still. My little dead birds I have snuck into this. So my artist statement for the show, in a way, like my work comes from a very joyful place. I really like making. Making makes me feel happy, like I'm doing something interesting, like I'm not just plodding through life, or like I'm contributing something maybe in my own way unique to the world. But then I think a lot about stuff like, what do we build? Do we build good things? Like, I'm a middle-aged dad, right? The kids are in bed. I'm in the garage tinkering on things. It's like, am I building a good life, right? So a lot of self-doubt in a lot of ways that I think is actually evident in the work. They look kind of joyful, but sort of sad, and they're not sure what they're supposed to be doing. And maybe they're all just weird self-portraits, which I think is just fine. So, my artist statement seemed a little down because I kept having these sort of dead bird motifs, almost like loss of innocence and things like that. But really, I think the work is, fairly joyful, I hope. So then you turn and you enter the main part of the gallery and you see this collection of stuff, right? From my garage, except with nicely lit and with space around them. All fresh work, which was kind of exciting for me to get a whole new batch of work ready for this show. A mixture of small works, large works, paintings, and sculptures. This one has a train set running around it in a sort of ode to nostalgia. So let's see, then turn to the right and you've got this sort of dead green bird, not dead green berg, although that'd be a funny twist on that if you're thinking about formalist criticism. My dead bird here. You can see it's a 4 foot by 4 foot sheet of plywood tipped, it's on like a little shelf. And the thing I like about the little shelves that I have for both of these paintings in the show is that it really makes you aware that they're on plywood. They're a sheet of material as opposed to just a two-dimensional flat surface. Of course it is two-dimensional. Mixture of drawing, painting, perspective, abstraction. To me, the bird is kind of open-ended metaphorically. I think it's kind of funny, but maybe kind of poignant at the same time. Have you ever had those moments where something's funny but sad and poignant, and you're like, ha ha ha, ha, awkward laugh? I think these kind of, to me, occupy that kind of zone. I hope anyway. So a close-up again of this thing that really did evolve for quite some time. A lot of these pieces start, like this whole part at the end here was a demo piece for a workshop I was teaching at Anderson Ranch. And part of these things come from, I remember this was on a sculpture years and years ago that got sort of orphaned. This began during a residency at Aramont. So a lot of these things, I'm not someone who just like cranks things out. I'm always making, but it's like a slow tinkering that then comes together to actually make something eventually. Hopefully my image clicking through is working. Again, 2 more images of that thing. I like the way this thing is up on this sort of architectural like plinth, as if it's some sort of monument to beautiful failure or something like that. I mean, really, I could give all these titles, but they're kind of all in that same vein. This sucker leans against the wall. You can, move around it, but I have it sort of leaning against the wall. It looks a little bit boat-like. I've got these bent lamination forms that sort of swoop around. So again, I'm using that cut plywood method where this piece is coming out of this piece, coming out of this piece. So it's just a shape of plywood that I keep cutting at an angle so that I can glue it on top of each other. to me, I just like that. I like the way it looks like terraced land. I like the way it looks, uh, painterly, the way the glue drips through. So, and I also like the way that it just uses the material as efficiently as possible. So even though I'm super inefficient with my time on these things, because I mean, so inefficient in terms of time, my material use is actually kind of efficient. Like I don't buy a lot of material. I mean, I do at first, but then it gets added, it gets morphed, it gets carved, it gets painted. And so the material accumulates. So it's not like I'm just buying sheet after sheet after sheet of ply all the time. Here's some close-ups. Oh, here's some close-ups now of, I really do hope that my work allows people to see something from across the room and be interested in it. And then as they get closer to wander through it and want to experience it and peep into it. So here's a little chair. Sometimes I have these little chairs in the work or as little solo sculptures. The chair is often used in a lot of art as a metaphor, as a stand-in, right, for the figure. So here we have this figure that has sort of boxed themselves in. I think we do that in life, build a little fort around ourselves to protect us, and that protection probably doesn't just walls out the rest of the world. Yeah. Another one of my dead bird paintings. This is Dead Baby Bird, again on the little shelf, leaning 4 foot by 4 foot piece of plywood. The thing that's nice about plywood is if you don't like the orientation of something, you can cut out a chunk, flip it, cut out a chunk, reorient it, work it back together. And so it's that process of like pounding these things and holding these things back together and sometimes lashing them back together that actually makes the surface and the object more interesting. On this photo here on the right, you can see the globs of paint. You can see that I've drilled into the surface. I think that just adds layers of interest. Here's a smaller one. Again, started off as a demo piece at a workshop at Shake Rag Workshops. And it was kind of interesting. And then I brought it home and it got way more interesting after I cut it apart. Cutting it apart sort of revealed things in a way that to me was more interesting than the way I had planned it. Last few images of the show here as we turn the last corner. I started as if you'd sort of start from right. Now we're going to the left. This sort of vessel-like object on these blocks. This train set running around it. The train, I'm thinking of as a nod to nostalgia and the things dads do. Put a train set around the tree, right? And it's very 1950s kind of dad approach too. It's like a Lionel O scale, O gauge. But then also just as this repetitive motion and this idea of sort of manifest destiny and how we bridge the coasts and, and link the rail lines is a great achievement in the way we talk about it. But here, this is just going around the circle. It's kind of funny and maybe pathetic. And so maybe I'm questioning that idea. Maybe, I don't know. I'll let you guys decide here. Questioning this idea of what do we build? What do we do? What do we value? We have a lot of conflicting ideas in our society of how we might have been brought up versus how we might be revisiting our value system now. Last shot here of this floor work. Again, started off as parts I was doing during a residency, brought them home, finally connected them all into this very long, linear, almost tool-like piece. Here's a boat-like, tool-like thing. Here's another painting-like object up against the wall. Kind of vessel-y at the bottom, but operates more two-dimensionally at the top, even though there is dimension to it. So hopefully that gave you a sense of some of my history and some of my most recent work. I guess perhaps now I'll turn it over to Professor Szorad.
Okay, so I am going to start with, this is, beginning of the century, I guess. This is postgraduate work. I graduated from East Carolina University in 1998. So this is kind of like the first big body of work I did post-graduation. And it was a series of metal hats. At that point, I did not have a lot of experience with larger scale forming. Actually, I didn't have a lot of experience with forming in general. I primarily fabricated materials. And I took a workshop with David Pimentel at Penland School of Craft, where I learned this forming technique using big plastic hammers and plastic mallets, and kind of fell in love with the whole process of moving large metal. So rather than just cutting it up and soldering it together, which I still like, but I really enjoyed the process of actually shaping the metal through repetitive hammer blows. And this whole series is sort of like feminine armor in a way. So I was playing around with the juxtaposition of making something that was feminine in its format, but also made out of obviously not a terribly soft or pliable or wearable material. So it kind of harkens back to maybe more helmets or armor rather than truly functional garments. So these are all copper. The coloration is sometimes patina, sometimes Prismacolor, sometimes enamel. So the image on the right, those feathers that are coming out of the top, those have been enameled. The image on the left, those sort of bulbous forms that are coming out, that is actually Prismacolor. This piece is completely colored with patina. This is an ammonia fume patina that builds up on copper, sort of like a bluish greenish. You never know exactly what you're going to get, and it's a little flaky sometimes. So the copper bits that you're seeing through there are the actual patina flaking off. And these were the final two of the series. Those sort of pins on them are removable and can be worn as jewelry objects. From the hats, I actually moved forward to creating dresses. I made 3 different dresses, but this is the only one that I'm going to show you. I had wanted them to articulate, so I wanted them to like be able to go on and off, and the other 2 do, but this one does not. It was just so heavy with the copper that there was no way to kind of make it articulate gracefully. And this is just roofing copper. I mean, I literally, to get large sheets of copper, I literally just go to the roofing store and buy it on rolls. It's a lot less expensive that way. I also, sorry, my son is calling me as I'm trying to talk. I also oscillate between objects and jewelry. So I kind of go back and forth. That's one thing I do in my studio practice to kind of, I guess, give some novelty or to keep from getting bored. So I'm moving back and forth between larger scale works and jewelry works. So these are jewelry scale. These are both brooches. This is primarily fine silver and sterling silver. And then the colored objects are enamels on copper. This is a larger necklace piece that's from the same series, silver for the metal, and then all the color is enamel on copper. Two more. Color is really important to me. I really, really love color. I was actually in undergrad, I was a dual major, both painting and metals. And color is something that's sometimes hard to bring into metals because, the metals are the colors that they are. And yes, you can patina metal, but you can only patina certain colors. So enamel is definitely one way that I use to get coloration onto my metal works. But I also, around this time, started bringing in less traditional materials. So I have some wood, and I'm sure that was influenced by being married to Travis. You know, there's lots of wood available, lots of paint available. So on the right-hand piece, those two sort of blue spheres are actually carved wood. And on the left-hand piece, there's a piece of carved wood that's kind of in the middle. And then those sort of orangish salmon colored, those are glass beads. Okay. Maybe 10 years ago, I had a sabbatical. It was also the same time that my son was born. So they kind of dovetailed together. I had a brand new baby at the same time I was like trying to produce this body of work, cellular or womb references. And I think those are kind of in relationship to him. I wanted to work larger. So I started incorporating some wood as a way to get even bigger than I was working before. So the white forms are a combination. I think it is mostly plywood, but it's been painted because, unlike Travis, I didn't want it to look like plywood. I wanted it to just kind of look like this nebulous substance. And then on top of that, I've cold joined different metal components. So those sort of linear components, those are actually piano wires that were left in my office when I started my job at Eastern Kentucky University. The main form that has all that coloration on it is copper that was hammered. And then I didn't have a kiln large enough to put it into enamel it. So that is encaustic work, so colored beeswax. That was put on top for the coloration. And then the smaller little form to the right is formed copper and then some fiber work. So the blue part that's popping out is actually an old sweater that I kind of cut apart and stuffed. It's sort of like a pillow, basically, that's sitting inside the copper form. And so this is just a slightly different view of the same piece. So I still have some silver components. I have some components that are similar to what I might use in a jewelry piece that I'm bringing in, but obviously silver is insanely expensive. So I did not want to be making a piece this large, primarily out of silver. Another piece in the same series, this is a formed copper vessel. And then the white is plywood that's been cut and sanded and then painted profusely so that it kind of has a softness to it. There is the form in the middle that's violet colored is enamel on copper. So that's a separate piece that's been cold joined on. And then around the rim is actually wool. It's like wool yarn that I've wrapped around a cord and then felted a little bit so that it becomes a linear element. So I started playing around with, different ways to get elements into these larger pieces. This piece is actually pretty large. It's the individual components are not big, but it takes up 38 inches in length. And again, primarily wood for the white information, and then that sort of black information that's coming over, some piano wire that's making some linear elements. And then those two pod forms, those are a combination of wood, enamel on copper, there's some woven steel wire, there's some felted wool, and then there's also some enamel components. I think, yeah, and so these are some close-ups of the pod forms. The plywood has been painted white. The wood on the right-hand piece, that's actually a walnut and it's been ebonized. And then I would take Prismacolor color pencils and kind of like color over it and then wax that in. So it's just sort of got a glaze of color over it. This is actually one of the dresses. This was the skirt from one of the dresses from one of the previous one of the first series that I showed you. So it no longer exists basically as a dress. It is now this vessel. And I think I kind of picked up that technique from Travis. It's a little bit harder to do in metals because with metals, if you're soldering, you have a limited window of how many times you can solder without the whole piece falling apart. So it's not as easy to cut things apart and then re-put them together. But this piece is coil joined, so I had a little bit more freedom. So I took the skirt and I closed it off and kind of made more of a vessel form. This is just steel binding wire. So this is just sort of like hardware materials. The red parts in the front, that is a heat patina on formed copper. And then the purple and the cream is actually like a industrial wool placemat, like from TJ Maxx, that I cut apart. And then the purple is fabric that I sewed and enriched together to kind of make this umbilical cord looking thing. All right. And then we went back to jewelry because that's what I do. I go back and forth between the two. So this grouping of jewelry, I was really still interested in trying to up the color ante. So maybe backing off the metal a little bit, not having as much metal as my key components, and bringing in more non-traditional materials. So I have some felted wool in here. I have cast resin, the pink sort of linear stuff on the side. That's like a t-shirt that I cut into strips. I have just pink beads. So lots of different materials, but they're all consistent in coloration. So even though they're very different as far as softness or hardness, we've got like a coloration family that's kind of tying them all together. And then I have metal components that are sort of forming the actual like hardware of the piece. So, you know, it functions because we have these metal components. It's kind of, because I'm a metalsmith by training and trade, it's still important to me that I have some metal in there, I guess. Two more pieces from this series. The one on the right has a felted wool sort of pod, and then it has a corresponding pod made out of the binding wire. There's enamels that have been sewn onto those. And then the back is a felted wool sort of cord that has been coil joined onto silver. And there is a functional mechanism there, like a clasp that allows you to take it on and off. The one on the left is more metal based. That blue beaded thing is actually, it looks like super fancy, but I did not make that. It's a necklace I found at Myers, and I sort of like cut out the components. I just wanted the beaded part. So I cut off the cheesy sort of metal clasp component that it came with, and then made this basket form that it could sit inside. This is maybe slightly more traditional. It's still part of the same series, but this is kind of going back to the straight metal, straight enamel. So this is, it's large. I mean, it's 5 inches in diameter. I think it's a pendant, but it might be a brooch. I can't remember anymore. Primarily made out of silver. And then that red is enamel on copper that has been torch fired rather than kiln fired. When you torch fire, you tend to get a lot of that black oxidation and bubbling through, which I tend to like. Another slightly more traditional piece, again, pretty large. This is a brooch, so it's like 5 inches in diameter, formed copper that has been enameled. So that weird sort of spidery looking thing is copper with enamel on it. And then there's a formed silver piece going around the outside edge, and then a granulated silver form in the middle, and a little pad of felted wool just to kind of give some softness between the enamel and the copper. I mean, sorry, the enamel and the silver. This piece is primarily felted wool and cut placemats. So those blue, like, very commercial looking kind of flowered things going up the sides. That was a placemat that I just cut into pieces and then felted a white border onto because I didn't like the way the edge looked when I cut it. The other wool components are hand felted, so I completed those on my own. And then the shiny blue flowers, those are actually steel. Like I think they are part of like a garden, like you could put it, I don't know. It's like again, I didn't form it. It was like a found thing and it was steel and you can enamel steel. So I just enameled them and put them in there. 2 more brooches. These are primarily resin with some fabric and a little bit of silver put in. The one on the left-hand side was resin and it was really god-awful ugly. So I started felting wool on top of it. I'm a little bit of a bulldog in that way. Like I have a hard time letting go of a piece. Like if I've put effort into it, I kind of just keep pushing it and trying something different. And every once in a while I do have to just be like, okay, that's just too far gone. It's ugly. But sometimes like if it still has some redeeming qualities, I'll just kind of do some radically weird things. And so felting on top of a piece of resin was kind of radically weird. But it actually turned out okay. I like it. And I think sometimes that helps me in my studio practice kind of come up with new ways of working with materials. All right. And then this is a very recent jewelry. So this is, I'm still kind of using the felted wool. I'm still using the enamel and the silver, but I also started taking fabric, synthetic fabric, and melting it with a heat gun. And I don't know why. I mean, I think I saw like a YouTube video of somebody just doing it for 2D work, like kind of using it as a way to get texture on a 2D process. And I was sort of like, oh, well, that would kind of be cool if I could make the fabric actually form the same way that I make metal form. And I can't do it exactly because it just doesn't have the same stiffness. But I like how when you take a synthetic fabric, it's essentially plastic. So if you apply heat to it, it is going to melt. And you can control that melting so that you just get a little bit of a texture, or you can actually melt it to the point that it becomes plastic again. So I've been playing around with using that as a material. And of course, since it's clothing, I've got a full range of color that I can use. This piece, it's primarily, it started with that felted pod in the middle, and then I made an enamel form that went on top of it. And then that pink and blue sort of scrunchy fabric, that is synthetic fabric that I've heated with the heat gun. I specifically like the lining of like prom dresses. That's my favorite fabric because it's very lightweight. And then when you melt it, you just get this really, really nice crinkle. And that's what this is. So I like to go to Goodwill and get like the biggest prom dresses or, the biggest bridesmaids dresses I can find, because then I get a whole bunch of fabric for pretty cheap. And then it's got some silver components and some more felted wool for the cord going around the neck. These are more functional, like these you could actually wear every day, whereas, like this previous necklace is gigantic. It's not, it's a statement piece when you wear it. These you could actually wear. They're still kind of statement earrings, but you could wear these and people wouldn't be like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? And these are a combination of silver, enamel, and resin sheet. So that sort of pink transparent and the yellow transparent, it's actually like a commercial resin sheet that is primarily used in the interior design field, but you can call the company and you can order little samples of it, and they're like the perfect size for jewelry. And I just saw it apart with my jeweler's saw and then file the edges, and I really like it because it's lightweight and it's a transparent color, whereas enamel is always going to have an opacity to it. There's metal behind it, so you can't see completely through it. Another piece, large enamel in the front with a felted wood pod that's kind of setting it. A knitting needle, a blue knitting needle is actually threaded through the wool pod. Got some silver components, got some more of that sheet resin that I'm purchasing from that company, and then just cutting into parts. And then also some of the melted fabric or heated fabric. This piece has actually changed. You know, sometimes I take photographs and then it's like, it's not really done. So this piece has actually changed. It's got more things going on now, but basically formed copper with enamel. I've started to get into having more complex forms. So instead of just like a simple form with enamel over it, I want forms that are kind of going in and out, and I'm actually starting to rivet multiple forms together, which is a little dicey with enamel because it can cause some cracking. But it allowed me to get a little bit larger. So again, you know, the actual enamel piece is about 5 inches. It's a very large pendant. All right, and that is actually all I have. I've got more images, but they're my student work, and I don't think you probably want to see those. So I will end the show. Does anybody have any questions for either Travis and I?
Besides like clasps and stuff like that, do you ever make any other functional pieces in your necklaces?
Like, do you mean, do I have
like moving parts and things like that? I know with metal, a lot of times you can create a lot of interesting like points of movement and stuff like that. So I didn't know if you had any like interesting doodads or anything like that in your pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think different ones. Can you still see images?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Yeah, I mean, like, for example, right here in the middle, that is riveted together. So there's a top layer of metal, and then there's the enamel and the wool, and then this piece is actually going on the bottom. And so that sort of moves apart, kind of scissors apart.
Okay. Yeah.
There's one up here. This one, this is actually a ball joint. And this is like, I made one of these in grad school simply because my grad teacher was like crazy into mechanics. I am not so much, but I made some things while I was in grad school just because he made them. And I was like, I want to make one of those too. And it had been kicking around for years. And so this basically kind of like rotates in, not fully 360, but, you know, kind of like a modified 360. So yeah, I do usually have something that is truly fine metals in there to kind of satisfy those metals people, you know, like, so that when I'm showing, because I primarily, when I'm showing my work, the more sculptural stuff, I might enter into exhibitions that are a little bit more open-ended. But if I'm making jewelry, I am entering them into exhibitions that are metal specific. So I do have to kind of compete with people who are not using found objects or materials that are non-traditional. So I do tend to have, yeah, those elements.
Hi, Felicia.
Hi.
I would just like to say, I always find it fascinating when artists' work starts to, with couple artists work, also a couple, when their work starts to kind of like reflect one another. And so that was really fascinating with seeing and hearing about you and Travis's practice, and that your color usage is immediately memorable. Travis talked a lot about his process with saving and scavenging materials, and how long he works on a single piece. But I'm curious, I really love the way that you're so innovative and resourceful with found objects and even like commercial objects, because I'm a craft artist as well. And I think that it's easy to fall into that practice of how everything has to be handmade.
Yeah.
So I love that you're using found objects in your pieces. But I'm curious about like do you start with a sketch and then you go and actively search for those pieces, or do you just constantly scavenge and collect and then categorize and then go through your collection?
That's a really good question. And actually, I usually do explain that, but I forgot to. I have gotten to a point that I have a large enough collection that I don't draw anymore. So obviously, you know, when I was in graduate school and, you know, probably even for the first 10 years out of graduate school, I would still start with pencil and paper. And I no longer do that. I do what I call three-dimensional drawing. So I have just got tons of half-finished pieces and parts that, you know, I maybe made during a workshop, but never did anything with. And I will start to move those parts around on my table. And if I like it, but I'm not 100% sure about it, I might take a photograph of it just to kind of keep it in my head. If I'm feeling pretty good, then what I do is I start designing the filler components. So, you know, I'll move the parts that I have, and then I'll go, okay, well, I need to fabricate a new connector here, or I need to fabricate a new connector there, or wow, that would be really cool if I had a felted pod here. So I do a little bit of both, but I almost always start with what I have. And I think you're right, you know, that comment about when you come from a crafts background, especially like the older you are coming from a crafts background, because there was definitely a time when if you were making craft, you made everything. I mean, like, it was not cool to find something on the side of the road. I mean, like, maybe Robert Ebbendorf could get away with that, but you could not just go out and pick something up and be like, look, I made this. And it was, I think that's really changed over the last 20 years within the craft media. But it's been very liberating, I think, because it allows you to do what you enjoy with the media, but not feel like, so now I have to make this, like, you know, I don't know, I can't think of any words, but, you know, it's like, you don't have to make every single component for it to still be your piece.
Thanks.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, I just want to remind everyone that Felicia and Travis's exhibition is up through April 15th. And many times it's helpful after the artists describe their process and history to revisit those exhibitions and have a more clearer and deeper understanding of the work the second time you view it. I want to thank Travis and Felicia for their time. I know they're both very busy, and we appreciate you guys participating today.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks so much. And email me or contact me if any students have any further questions.
I have a question for Travis.
Sure.
Your larger pieces that are constructed of found objects in wood, they're quite large. Is there a point at which you're like, I'm gonna stop touching this. This is finished. Do you sketch out your like larger pieces? Is there a point like you recognize you should stop? Do you have like a process?
Oh, that you've that's my dilemma right there. You've been, yes, that's the problem, right? You're not, with that way of working, sometimes you're not quite sure. And oftentimes I'll submit things and exhibit things, but then later they get cut apart. Sometimes I kill things, but yes, I start with sketches. But there's my bell. And as a public school teacher, unfortunately, I have to scoot now. But thank you so much. And by all means, any student who wants more info, let me know. I'd love to talk to you more.
Bye. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.